Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is that better? Lean in. Thank you for coming this evening, so close to Christmas. So I'm going to, in the festive spirit, talk to you about corpses of many, and kippers also, but mostly corpses. So I'm going to jump around a little bit in the chronology in which I show work. We're going to sort of keep it under an hour, including time for questions. So I wanted to start by showing a fairly recent piece of work. In fact, it's something that's still in development, but I think it serves as a good introduction to talk about some of the things that I'm interested in and the way in which I work. So it also involves a corpse also. So this is a piece of work called A System for Communicating with the Ghost of Sir Christopher Wren, which I started making maybe last year, but sort of developing through this year. So for various reasons, I discovered that, and I'll elaborate on those, but I discovered that Christopher Wren, while he was still a student at Oxford University before he worked as an architect, he developed a very primitive form of sign language that uses the fingers of the left and the right hand to form letters rather than words. So the way that it works is, I was going to bring you all the key and then I forgot, so sorry, but I'm not going to perform the whole of this talk using this, so it's okay. That you would have the letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, blah, blah, and so on. And then to signify which one of those, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that would be A. That would be F. This would be K. The colour coding was also something that Wren developed at that time as a way to teach people this. So when you've got the key, you can spot really easily what the letters are. So all of the letters relate to these codes that I'm using. So the reason that I think that this is a kind of good thing to start with is that it kind of talks about research of historical kind of positions or artifacts or material or knowledge, which is something that's at the heart of all of the work that I make. It uses photography, so these are all, they were all photographed on slide film, and then they are projected or shown on kind of slide viewers of some kind, so it uses photographic technology in some way, but also kind of the humour of the work is also there to try and kind of cut through perhaps the indexical nature of photography and how it's been used as a kind of medium for evidence and for as a didactic medium in many ways. So the starting point for this is this factual sign language that exists, but now I'm using it in this kind of more whimsical way to try and communicate with somebody from beyond the grave. So why would I wish to do that? Why would I, want to try and do? I should say that the way that the projection works is I worked with somebody to program it so that the combinations of fingers are completely random, and then at certain points while it's being displayed in the gallery, I sit and I transcribe the letters that are produced, or I record them for the duration. So I've got this ongoing combination of letters with messages possibly being revealed to me. So the way that I encountered this sign language is actually through a building. So again, this is, I think, a useful way to introduce my practice, that I'm interested in architecture and the materials of building, and also the sort of historic narratives that might underpin them. So this is a place called Peterson's Tower, or Sway Tower, or Peterson's Folly, it's sometimes known as. And my interest in it stemmed from the fact that it was in fact, I said this once to somebody at the Hepworth, I see there's a crowd here from there, that it still remains the largest building of non-reinforced concrete, and they said that that's not true because the Hepworth also uses non-reinforced concrete. So we can fight that out at the end. But something that is interesting about this is that the man who built it, Andrew Thomas Turton Peterson, in the early part of the 19th century, claimed to be instructed by the ghost of Sir Christopher Wren. in the drawing of the plans. So this is a quote from Concrete Quarterly from March 1957. Scintillating. It's still running, Concrete Quarterly, if you want a subscription for Christmas. Between 1879 and 1885, Andrew Thomas Turton Peterson built the 218-foot tower in the New Forest. It was designed, he believed, under the spirit guidance of Sir Christopher Wren. The tower's final use was as a mausoleum for its creator, whose ashes were, at his special request, placed in the basement of the tower after his death in 1906. One of the last survivors of the workmen he had employed performed the task. And also, quite interestingly, I found from Medium and Daybreak, the spiritualist weekly newspaper, from 1883, an interview or an article with ATTP. So some 4 years ago, so Christopher Wren, controlling the Medium, said, "You are thinking of building a tower. What breadth are you going to make your foundation?" asked the spirit. "Well, I was thinking of making it 20 feet, a tenth part of the contemplated height, that is 200 feet. Had you not better make it 24 feet, added the spirit, at the same time giving reasons for the recommendation. So on finding this, I was kind of compelled to myself have this conversation with Wren. Perhaps he could impart the same guidance. And that's where this work comes from, with the slides and the projectors, and how I'm trying to kind of resurrect the spirit. So this is what it looked like when it was installed at Zabludovich Collection in 2014. So in that instance, it was 2 medium format slide projectors projecting onto the wall. So I also use these slide viewers that project onto themselves. And the other thing that I'm increasingly trying to do, and we'll talk about as this talk goes on, is I tend to work on a number of different things at the same time, and some of them connect really directly, and some of them perhaps feel quite disparate, or they have these disparate starting points. And one of the things I'm interested in trying to do is pull these things together. So the environment in which I showed the work, that was this kind of separate room that I built inside the gallery with this stud partition, was clad in bricks from Birmingham Central Library. And in a way, I'm interested in this other idea of resurrection, and resurrecting the corpse of this building in Birmingham that's been important to me. I think also is this kind of overlooked and important moment in a very British kind of municipal form of modernism, but an important one nonetheless. I'll skip forward actually. So this is what the building looked like yesterday. It saddens me to kind of stand here in front of it. So it's, what's the term used? Immunity from listing runs out in January. So the developers are desperately trying to kind of punch as many holes in it as possible before anybody can reapply to get it listed. So English Heritage in 2008 recommended that it should be given Grade 2 listing, but that was thrown out and it's due to be demolished. So I now am using, so this was the first iteration in 2014, but I'm interested in that these bricks can kind of stand in for this broader idea of kind of value of what's important and what isn't, and also of resurrection as it kind of feeds through my work. So I'm still working with these, which pains me physically as well, because my studio is on a first floor with no lift. So each time I install them anywhere, I also have to carry them back and upstairs to my studio. So that leads quite nicely into work that I've made. And this is sort of as I say, I'm jumping around a little bit. Predates the things that I've just shown you, and was a commission. It started as a commission to make some work about Birmingham Central Library, but became something a little more broader, but still quite tightly focused. So this is what the library looked like before they started to pull it apart. It's a photograph that I made. But actually, on being commissioned to make this work about this building, that, as I've said, I think is incredibly important, I actually became more interested in a collection of 487 archive boxes, which, as you can see, are in kind of various states of disrepair. So this was a collection that was deposited at some point in the last 10 years and belonged to the architectural practices of John Maydin, who was the architect of Birmingham Central Library. So I found this metaphor to be compelling, that in the basement of the architect's building, which was at that point scheduled to be demolished, also existed this collection, which was also had kind of been treated with this same shabbiness and same kind of lack of attention and care that his building, and not just that building, his wider legacy had been treated with. So I focused all of my time on these 487 boxes and kind of narrowed into this as a way that I could approach dealing with this broader idea of what that building was. So in order to do that, I had to become a volunteer with the library. So I cleaned all of the boxes. So I photographed them first. So I set up this little kind of ad hoc studio in the basement of the library. So I thought I wanted to isolate them and have them. To me, there was something that suggested an importance about treating them this way, as these individual specimens that could perhaps tell more about that broader position of the architect and also that legacy than they could as this sort of collection that was there. So I photographed all of them on these neutral grey backgrounds. I then had to clean them all, and then I had to compile the box level index, so just listing all of the information on the outside. So becoming an amateur archivist as a way to get access to the material. I photographed all 487, again on medium format slide film. And in fact, this was the first time I started to work with slide projectors. And the reason for that, let me skip forward a little bit, was that I wanted to have a display that could facilitate multiple connections in a way that static images couldn't. So it was important to me that you could see, perhaps these two images in relation to each other, but you would also, one of them would change and one of them would stay, and you would see an image in relation to something else also. And I could create these multiple connections within the gallery space. And that to me was something that it was trying to have some fidelity to that process that you have when you're sitting in, I say when you are, as if everybody does this, when one is sitting in a cold basement of a library and you're flicking through these boxes and you yourself are kind of making these multiple connections between objects, images and information that perhaps weren't intended. So it was important to me to try and have that within the exhibition. If I flick forward a little bit, this is how the images worked within the space. And this is why, so although I wanted to have this projection so I could have that multiple thing that I'm talking about, the idea to shoot everything on medium format slide film and then source these difficult to work with and expensive Hasselblad projectors wasn't really about that. It was about having a kind of sense of value within these images that perhaps that the objects don't have in the world. So they were projected at about 3 meters square. The thing about using a projector of that kind is that it really holds the detail and actually becomes more sculptural and more physical within the gallery space. I think that just the light passing through the film kind of tends to hold the space in a way that a digital projector doesn't, and certainly slides of that size. So there was those two reasons for using this technology, that thing about creating these multiple connections, but also giving the images a quality that they lacked as objects in the world. And actually that push and pull between image and object is also something that runs through my work, and is this constant sort of battle or this interrogation or trying to create kind of environments that can have this slippage between that, or situations perhaps is better than environments. So in addition to photographing all of the boxes, what I then started to do was look through them all, as I said, and photograph objects that were of interest to me inside them. So this is a box that says libraries on the front, from 1964, and it's from a study visit that John Maydin undertook to North America to visit various libraries and buildings as information and research for his own building he was making in Birmingham. So this is a diagram of the suggested organisation of the Arts and Architecture Library, and then this is a photograph of the Arts and Architecture building at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. So there's sort of perhaps less of a direct humour in this, well certainly, than there is in, say, the Christopher Wren work or other things that I've done, but I am interested in this folly that might exist as me revisiting these locations, you know, however many years after the architect, and what possible kind of answers or information can I hope to find from this visit. So the idea of folly is also something that, not just architectural follies, but a folly in production is something that I'm interested in within the work. This is a postcard of the Beinecke Rare Book Library, also at Yale, and then this is a photograph of the Vermont marble cladding of the library that I made. And again, just some kind of installation shots that show you how this worked. The other thing about this installation is that you kind of activated the space. So it felt, because architecture was so important to this work, that I should really try and use the architecture of the gallery and activate it, so the way that things came on and off meant that you had to move around the space in order to have those connections between the images. Get my water, sorry. Just checking I wasn't plugged into anything and pull everything off the lectern. So now I'm jumping right back, but also, you could also argue, well, it's part of the work that I'm showing here. So it's this ongoing piece of work, but some of these photographs go back to 2004. I made them while I was still a student in Wolverhampton. And so they're photographs of what was at that point the MG Rover factory in South Birmingham, that had been there for over 100 years. It closed in 2005 with the loss of 6,500 jobs. At its peak, there were 22,000 people working there when it was British Leyland in the 1970s. So I started making photographs whilst it was still operational, but large parts of it were surplus to their needs. And then when it did close, it took me then about 6 months to get access, and then over about 2 years, I continued to photograph this site. So I guess at that point, I was just trying to kind of compile this comprehensive kind of archive of this place that I felt was of, and still feel is of, international significance. Lots of my family have worked in the motor industry in the Midlands. In fact, my brother still works at Land Rover. So there'd always been it'd always been something that, you know, people in the family had kind of talked about. So, you know, it was just that kind of compulsion and also that's sort of not quite genuine either, because it's also quite removed from me, you know, that I've never worked in an environment like this. So there's also this voyeuristic idea of I wanted access to this site. And I was talking to somebody about it earlier today, and actually just the experience of being able to walk around a 600-acre site of this cobbled together factory was, this incredible experience really. And I mean, in some ways, I think the photographs they're really important as historical documents. I think they're also problematic, which I'll talk about. And they definitely are secondary for me in the kind of experience I had of walking around there. And I think that's slightly problematic. So whilst I was making these photographs, I was also sort of torn by these things that I'm talking about now. And part of that, and perhaps I wasn't articulating it at the point, was that there's something about the reductive nature of photography, that when you have an incredibly complex situation, such as the closure of a factory, that there's a disparity between the situation and then your means of trying to do something about that, or there was for me. and something that kind of still remains. So I was making this work, but also with having doubts about whether this was an appropriate kind of response. There are things to how do I say this? I guess to defend myself from my own accusations in some way. That one of the things that's really appeals to me, so this work sits in a number of collections, but one of them is the Library of Birmingham, as it is now, collection, and not as artworks, but just as information. You know, that you can go and request to see these photographs if you're interested in old factories in Birmingham, and they can be brought to you. So I think there's something about that value that they have as historical kind of artifacts that is pleasing to me, that they can exist in these two worlds, but also, as I say, at this time there was something that was problematic to me. Whilst I was so this last one was still like 6 months after production had ceased, so pretty much all of the factory, in fact, was just left as it was. People had just been called to a meeting and then didn't go back. But whilst I was making these photographs, a Chinese company bought all of the physical assets and the intellectual property rights, and then moved the factory to China. So I went to Nanjing, which is just not too far from Shanghai, and then also photographed the same factory, essentially, the same tooling, but obviously very different situation out in China. So that was this way, I guess, of kind of trying to extrapolate out and sort of tell more of this story. However, and it was an exhibition at the New Art Gallery Warsaw in 2008. I applied for East International at about that same time, which was a fantastic open submission exhibition that used to happen every year. Unfortunately, so I was selected for it, and that was in 2009. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. And I was invited to, I think I'd submitted this work. So naturally they asked if I could show this work, and I said that I wasn't really interested in that because what I wanted to do was actually make some work that was also about these difficulties I had about these photographs, and as I say, their inability to say something about the complexity of the situation. So I made a series of 4 screen prints. And I also sourced a number of historic objects that were shown in a kind of museum vitrine case, alongside just 3 other photographs that I made at Longbridge. So the way that I thought I would go about trying to make this new work was that I would focus in on a specific point, and I decided that the year 1979 would be a good kind of focus to my inquiry. So it was Margaret Thatcher was elected it was the 4th of May 1979, and then at the Longbridge factory, Derek Robinson, who is known as Red Robbo, who was the Communist Union convener, was sacked on the 22nd of November 1979. I was also born in November 79, so it felt like this kind of, if I could just take this quite tight historical period, I could perhaps make some work that also sort of undermines or cuts through the definitive nature of the photographs that I'd made. So I started to sort of research and find material first, which I'll come to in a sec. That was the first point. In fact, reading every issue of the Birmingham Post from 1979 was my first point. It was as tedious as that sounds. But this work that I've shown here, one of the things I started to look at was the speeches, interviews and statements of Margaret Thatcher. And I found that, I'm sure this is still the case, there's a Margaret Thatcher archive. Her clothes went up for auction today as well. There's a website that archives all of her speeches, interviews and statements, and it tells you, some of them are available in full, but as a minimum it tells you how many words they were, and it also has this categorization system. It tells you whether it's a major, minor, trivial or key. So I added all of the cumulative word counts between those 2 dates in May and November, and then made these screen prints of, so this was the 125,295 major words, minor, trivial and key. because I was interested that you would have these different registers, not just of what somebody who's leading the country might say, but also different registers of information that exist that might sort of, underpin certain ideologies that were at play at that time. So this is an advert from a copy of a men's pornographic magazine, Men Only. It's a topical reference to the great train robber Ronald Biggs. This is a photograph from the official archive of the Motor Heritage Museum. Does anyone know what car that is that's about to be unveiled? It's 1979, if that helps. Metro. Well done. I don't know what prize you get for that. It is indeed the Metro, or the LC8 as it was known then by its code. A pamphlet from the Communist Party of Great Britain I got from the Modern Records Office at the University of Warwick. Socialist Worker Party bulletin. And then it sort of brings us right to where we are now. A copy of the complete Fawlty Towers scripts opened on an episode called The Kipper and the Corpse. So these are all displayed in the vitrine case, and as I say, I was interested that I have this categorization system on the wall of Thatcher's kind of utterings, but then also there's this push and pull between sort of major or trivial information in the case. But in a way, the more interesting stuff is the trivial. It is Fawlty Towers, so I'm just going to come out of here while I just show the key scene. I know this will be the most entertaining bit of the whole talk. If anyone wants to leave after, it's fine. I don't mind.
Notice the little wave of the wall when he slammed the door there. High production values. That's in a way has been kind of the key reference for me, and it's why I'm still banging on about it. So this was something I made in 2009. But actually I think that Basil Fawlty is much more important than Margaret Thatcher in a way to understand the situation at Longbridge, or as a beginning to kind of understand that. And that's also why it brings me to why I'm still working on this, because as I said, I think it is this important site, but I feel that there's still more work to be done about it. So I also should perhaps say it kind of makes sense to mention it. Alongside
lots of projects I've done, I have worked on lots of, kind of, I guess the term would be socially engaged, but projects that have felt like they've sat alongside my practice but not really encompassed it. So I worked with Icon Gallery in Birmingham, with a hospice in Birmingham for nearly 3 years on a number of projects. And a few kind of things like that. And they've always been things that I've really enjoyed doing, but never felt like I've been able to kind of make my work. So this is the closest I've come to really sort of pulling those things together, where I'm, kind of working with people in the community, but I'm also making my work. So this is Keith Woodfield, who turned 81 last Wednesday. So Keith worked at the factory for 34 years. On engine rectification, and here he is helping me strip the engine out. So that's, hope you've all seen how it looks upstairs now. There's a slide actually, so if you haven't, you will. I thought you might like to see it before I started butchering it. It looks really good there, but I can tell you it wasn't. So the fuel tank was leaking, and there were holes in the floor and various things. Although strangely it did have a full MOT when I bought it. For those of you who don't know, I've bought a 1979 Mini. It's a Clubman shell. It's a 1275 GT. It was originally black, but it should have these garish gold stripes along the bottom, which will be reinstated. And I guess it's this continuation, but what I'm interested in at this point, I guess it's not just twofold, it's many folds. But the two kind of driving things for me are, I'm interested in the materiality, so how much of the tumult of the period kind of can reveal itself or is carried in the materials of this car. And photography as a sort of an interrogative tool is part of that, but also how can this give me access to other kinds of information. So Keith Well, Keith, when I was talking about this exhibition in Leeds, which I desperately tried to get him to come to, but he wasn't interested, said, like, what are you talking about? How is putting the shell of a car in a gallery an artwork? Because and I've talked about it over and over about the kind of processes and the engagement, but he thinks it's bollocks. And he's not interested in this, he's not interested in it as an artwork, but he's probably more interested than me or anyone else in this project to restore this car. And what he also comes with is this incredible information in these stories. So the car becomes a way to access that material. And yeah, that sounds quite mercenary. He's also a friend now, you know, I don't mean it in that way. I met him this morning and nearly missed my train. I took him a box of biscuits for Christmas. But yeah, sorry, too many anecdotes. So this is what it looks like upstairs. We can skip past that, but just to say that this process of making these photographs and the two large ones that are there is about that. It's this kind of quasi-forensic process of trying to document the corrosion and the wear and how that might resonate with the information I'm also gathering about the situation in which this car was made. Along the way, what's really nice about this is it just suggests kind of works that I should make. So I'm making a little video. I don't know if that's the Birmingham accent or the echo, but I'm sure you didn't catch any of that. But so I'm making these videos of the processes also. So this was Keith. After we installed the car here, we've been working on stripping the engine down. And because Keith worked on this for so long, he did all of that himself. So he's very insistent on health and safety and wearing gloves, which is surprising for somebody who worked during the 70s in British industry. But and I'm also, alongside that, I'm doing a lot of this work as well, and I guess it's sort of like doing a really long, slow apprenticeship. So this is me, so I'm trying to reuse as many of the parts as possible. So even the original nuts and bolts, so those have all been stripped down, cleaned in paraffin baths, and then just kind of cleaning these individually with this wire brush. So also I've used this term corrective gesture. I'm interested in taking this, as I say, this object that comes out of this tumultuous time, and through this process of stripping it down and removing these kind of degraded and rotten materials, it's this, and kind of collecting this information, it's this corrective gesture. It's also making it better than it ever could have been at the time. My adherence to health and safety is slightly less strict than Keith. It looks nice and shiny when I get to the end, but I won't play the whole thing. I'm also continuing my research into material from 79 as well. So this is a diary of Mr. Savage, who worked in industrial relations. This is an entry from Thursday the 15th of February 1979. Came in a bit late because I stayed at home to clear my insurance problems. I found that Longbridge had resumed to work today. A slow start because of the fact that although management had asked people to come in to light up, no one really reported for work until normal starting time. This meant that the factory was not as warm as it could have been, and number 5 assembly stopped work because they claimed it was too cold. Barry, Stan Mullet and Emily said they had walked through the shop and it was in the order of 58 degrees to 63 degrees. There were people sat about in overalls playing cards and dominoes, and Mullet's attitude was, if it's warm enough to sit about playing dominoes, then it's warm enough to work. It goes on. It's sort of like I'm repeating Basil Fawlty in a way, but from a diary. But so kind of trying to sort of, and I've also met a couple of people from industrial relations that have been really interesting as well in what they've been. Anyway, I should also say why I'm doing this, that I'm not a historian, and I don't, and it's probably coming across weighted in that way, and I guess it's because it's work in progress, and I'm not sure what bits are going to stay and what bits aren't when this kind of manifests as if it ever becomes a definitive thing, within my practice. But I think that this period that I'm fixating on of 1979 we're really still dealing with the ramifications of things that happened in that year. And actually events of the last 12 months or so, with this kind of polarisation or this false dichotomy between right and left, and some of the rhetoric that we're seeing is very similar to things that we were seeing at that point when things were perhaps more overt. So it's interesting to me that by taking this kind of historic viewpoint, I also think it's a way to try and kind of better understand contemporary situations. So this is the sort of where I'm at the moment, and this is how, it's a little preview of how the next bit of the British Art Show will look in Edinburgh in February. So the engine, as you saw, Keith has taken it apart. So I'm going to be displaying just the engine in pieces, but it's going to be sitting on these newspapers that I've been sourcing from 79 again. But all of them have political cartoons that relate to British Leyland in some way. There were 19 in total throughout that year. They range from, predominantly they're about night shift workers sleeping. They also depict the workers as pigs, or in this instance as British Leyland is written on the back of the coat on the ledge, with Thatcher being advised to just leave them. The words are, no, ignore him, I think it's just a cry for help. So the objects will be sitting on these newspapers, but hopefully it feels like this kind of incidental thing, because it's something you would do in a garage, just to keep all the bits together. I'm also photographing all of the components on, this colour's not quite right, but on historic colours. So this is Reynard bronze. Other colours that the car came in were Java green, Snapdragon yellow, denim blue, russet brown, which I think is very particular to the time, Cumulus grey and carmine. So I'm also researching every colour of car that was ever produced at the factory. Anyway, I sort of am running out of time, so I'm going to flick forward to just to here actually. This is nothing to do with cars and nothing to do with the work here. It's sort of work in progress, but also some of this stuff dates back to some of the earliest work that I've made. So I have an exhibition, a solo exhibition at Spike Island in July this year. And the thing I'm working on is this sprawling kind of set of interconnected narratives that come from these three starting points of Scottish shale, Welsh slate, and Portland stone. So the things I just skipped through were an installation view at Flattime House from a show that I did in a residency, which really kind of made me start to think about, I worked on this specific thing during that residency, but I want to pull together these quite disparate kind of narratives. Anyway, I don't know if there's really time to get into this actually looking at it. Can I give you like a quick version of it with that? I'll do that. It's confusing anyway because it's real work in progress and I'm not really sure where this is going, but I think it'd be nice to show the stuff anyway. So the starting point, or one of the earliest works I made, but actually not the starting point for this, was photographs that I started to make around the Welsh slate mining town of Blaenau Ffestiniog, which in 1951, so it sits geographically in the centre of Snowdonia National Park. But if you look at it on a map, you'll see that the Snowdonia National Park has a hole in the middle, and that's the town of Blaenau Ffestiniog. So when it was designated, the town was deemed to lack sufficient natural beauty to warrant inclusion in the national park. During the residency that I did at Flattime House, the thing I was most interested in was John Latham's work with the remnants of the Scottish oil industry. In the 19th century, Scotland, as hard as this is to believe, was at the centre of global oil production. When John Latham was working with the Development Agency in the 1970s as part of Artist Placement Group, he was tasked with what should they do with the remnants of that. And he came up with this really beautiful idea, is you should do nothing, and actually you should have them classified as monuments. He also said you should put one of my big book sculptures on top of them, but they didn't do that, and I think it's better for it, and I think the idea is better for it. But to me, that sort of reminded me of this place in Wales that I've been interested about for some time, that again, you've got this kind of polar treatment of the land, and It also actually, while I was putting this together, made me think of some of the debates that are flying around at the moment of kind of useful art, and actually thinking about these judgments that are kind of taking place as well, that you have the labour manifest in the landscape of both of these places have been treated in a very different way, and the value judgments that apply there. And then Portland stone, more directly, I'm interested in it as a material that's been used, this is just a shot from a quarry there, for the production of monuments historically, but also the dust of Portland stone in its use of concrete, and perhaps more whimsical uses of concrete rather than what, say I was talking about something like Birmingham Central Library. So this, I told you it was sprawling, and I'm giving you the quick kind of abridged version. This is a mould for a cast that the British patron and very bad poet Edward James made in the Mexican rainforest he made this whole thing in the 50s, 60s and 70s, or 60s, 70s and 80s. It was a concrete sculpture garden called Las Posas, which I visited a couple of years ago. So I guess this thing about monuments is also really key, and a relationship again between image and object and this push and pull. And I will just read this one kind of section from here. This is from Edward James, who talks about, at one time I was so impressed, so enthralled by the beauty of colour and form that I wanted to perpetuate it forever. Long before I knew about movies, I tried to imitate the camera and say tick when I was moved by something, feeling that I was recording this particular scene forever, and then I would say tack when it was over. My mental film clips lasted longer and longer. First they would just be a few seconds, and then after about a year, several minutes. I would say tick, and then something ugly would spoil the scene, or something boring would happen, and I would say tack. When I was about 8, I said tick one day and forgot to say tack, and it's been running ever since, this interior camera. So this idea of equating kind of sculptural or kind of building activities with photographic activities is kind of always running through. And because of his immense wealth, that he wanted to fix these ideas in concrete because that was something that was available to him. John Latham, as I've said, I was interested in the work he was doing in Scotland. That led me to this really kind of neat cyclical story of a man called James Paraffin Young, who I'm just going to show this quick video clip. This is James Paraffin Young with the explorer David Livingstone.
How is this competition from abroad going to affect you, Captain? They tell me several smaller firms have already closed down.
Well, David, this is a large concern, not to be able to meet any competition. You find the shale we're using now is much cheaper than coal.
But I thought you said it gave less oil than the coal you began with, bulky.
That's true, but the supply is absolutely unlimited. We can expand in a way that's quite out of the question of cannibalism. It's getting dearer and scarcer every year.
I see. And I suppose as you expand, you will find new methods and also improve the quality.
Yes, we must find the new markets and develop the other things, such as wax and sulfur aluminum. We'll be all right, David.
I thought you might just enjoy the quality of the acting. It's important to keep that in. So James Paraffin Young was the person who first extracted oil from shale, and was the reason that this activity took place in Scotland, so the reason that the bings, the remnants of shale, exist. Interestingly, he was an old school friend of the explorer David Livingstone, and funded Livingstone's explorations around Africa to discover the Victoria Falls. John Latham was born on the banks of the Zambezi River next to the Victoria Falls. His father was working out there. So it's this kind of irresistible set of connections that then I'm sort of linking through to other things. As a memorial to his friend Livingstone, James Young built this model version of the Victoria Falls in his garden in Scotland. So again, this kind of building and memorials is also something that I'm still kind of doing. And I've also visited the Victoria Falls, and I've been making some photographs and videos there as a way of kind of piecing these things together. And then finally, and I really am finishing, this is a drawing of the architect Clough Williams Ellis, famous as the architect of Portmeirion, the Italianate village where The Prisoner was filmed in North Wales. The reason I have him here is through other research I discovered that he was one of the advocates for that exclusion of Blaenau Ffestiniog from the national park. And here you have Clough speaking with the ghosts. I forget who they all are, but the key one and the person nearest him is the ghost of Sir Christopher Wren. So this was a cartoon that appeared in Punch, in which Clough's kind of trying to talk about his reasoning for building this kind of whimsical, fanciful Italianate village in North Wales. He also was commissioned by the BBC in the 1945, which was some kind of centenary of Wren, to present a programme, and his idea for that was that he would have a fictitious conversation with the ghost of Sir Christopher Wren on the steps of St Paul's during the Blitz. And I did have another slide, but that feels like a nice way to finish, as we start with the ghost of Wren and we finish with him. So I thank you for listening to that this evening. Thank you. If you want to see how this all ends up, you have to come to Bristol in July. It will probably look very different to this, but here are the things that are part of
it. Did you want to take some questions?
Yeah, if anyone's got some.
Are there any questions? Stuart?
Have you engaged with people who've seen the video, worked in Longbridge? I just wondered how people felt about it. Like, a lot of our old industry is now just museum pieces.
Yeah, so I didn't show a picture of it, but all of the restoration work is happening at Longbridge. So while the car's here, I have all of the pieces in this glass-fronted cabin. It's like a sales office for second-hand cars. And it's on the site of one of the old conveyor belts at the factory. It's now being redeveloped as, it's sort of all right, it's a typical, kind of, there's Marks and Spencer's, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, so while I'm there, people come in all the time. I've also been doing monthly open days. So yeah, I've been interacting with lots of people who work there, who have family there. And actually, I think there's definitely an element of nostalgia that kind of comes through the conversations, but they tend to go along a similar arc where people start by just saying, it's terrible that it's gone. Actually, once you start talking to people, they start to unpick that sentiment themselves. And in as much as that it was, a place that was important to the identity of lots of people, it was also a pretty barbaric place to work. And I found a really interesting question to ask people, if they are becoming really kind of, misty-eyed and rose-tinted about it, is, would you have wanted your children to have worked there? And almost 100% of people say no. Because it was this repetitive slog. It was quite well paid, but so the recollections or the reminiscences and these stories that come across, they're quite complex in themselves, and they sort of go through. Yeah, if you talk to somebody for 10 minutes, it starts with a very sort of a typically nostalgic viewpoint of what it was, but actually quite quickly can move through this real sort of gamut of emotions, really. So yeah, and I'm trying to record some of these conversations, but it's difficult to do that in a natural way in which you get things that are worthwhile, I guess. So I still haven't recorded a conversation with Keith. I feel like we're sort of there for it now because he's just ignoring. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Well, I had a question, but you've kind of answered it, I think, already, which was
wonder about, obviously there's a huge difference between Fordian production, where every worker has a very limited job within making things, and the restoration centre. And I was kind of really wondering how that played out.
Yeah, well, again, it's not as clear cut as that in a way, because so absolutely there was this division of labour, you know, but you also, so Keith had a very specific job, but he can pretty much rebuild a car. So you had lots of people who worked there who were, you know, the job is semi-skilled, but that were also, and I don't know if this is something of the time, but they had this kind of natural inquisitive nature to know all of those other processes, and lots of them were also, well, lots of them were nicking enough bits to make their own cars, you know, kind of out the back door, but it's not quite, although the system is set up like that, the reality was quite different on the ground. And you would also have, I spoke to somebody who started their apprenticeship in 1979 and in fact was on strike on their first day. And I thought this was fascinating. One of the things he had to do for his apprenticeship was a module on industrial psychology. So he would have to observe different parts of the factory and different parts of the line. And he said you'd have parts of the factory where everybody hated each other, and they would actually try and make each other's jobs harder and worse as the days went on. And other parts of the line, I mean, it's probably natural that things are like this. There's all major, I think 22,000 people working there. Other parts of the line were these kind of utopian communities where everybody would, that the foreman and was irrelevant, that they kind of built this system where people could step in and do these things, and everyone knew how to do all these various processes. So again, although the system was there, the reality is kind of different. And it's trying to convey some of that complexity again that I'm trying to do. Now, whether I do that at the end, I mean, we don't know. So we'll see. Yeah?
I'll just add a little complexity, and never worked there, but a mate who did. And one of the things he said, being very interesting, was that behind the tea trolley on the night shift, there was a bloke came round selling hash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That mix of drugs and drink, yeah, it's a different part of the atmosphere.
Yeah, but there's, I mean, the thing that I guess I'm trying to arrive at is at the end I have this kind of, this nuanced set of, you know, or of information that you often have this sort of boiling down to these polarized or reductive points, I think, when you're dealing with a situation like this. And absolutely that will be true. It's also, somebody from industrial relations was telling me that another thing, you know, so 1979 was across the UK, not just at Longbridge, was the peak of the number of days lost to industrial action. And what he was saying is the company, if they had, so my brother, I said, works at Land Rover. If they have, at the moment it's just peak production because loads of people want to buy Land Rovers. If they have times when they don't, they can stand them down and he doesn't get paid. Nothing like that existed in the 1970s. So what the management would do is they would send out really controversial proposals of what they might do to change the conditions of the workers or the pay. So they would all down tools and walk out. So the management of the company was implicit in the kind of that culture of striking, and it was a way to save money. If you had 22,000 people in Cofton Park, you didn't have to pay them for weeks at a time. So it's trying to, there's not, you know, all of those things are true and all of them are not, you know, and it's trying to gather as much of that as possible. And there were people, selling all kinds of stuff, you know. Yeah. Yeah.
I can see a difference between the work with the hands and the work about Margaret Thatcher, the analysis that you did of the speeches. Mm-hmm. And so I would like to ask you if sometimes the archive and the use that you do of the archives, and they you feel that sometimes they trap you. That's the question.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think working with archival information and material is really dangerous. I think that fixing a car is more dangerous, but not in that sense. I mean that you can fetishize these kind of historic objects, and I think that can be problematic. So I made this show at Oriel Davies in Wales in 2008 that really, I think an exhibition, it gives you an opportunity to really look at what you're doing. And when I look at that show, and even at the time, it felt like this sort of glorified resource room, that it belonged to another show somewhere else. And in a way, what I'm trying to do now, and perhaps it doesn't quite come across at this point because I'm just showing you a lot of stuff, and a lot of these things aren't going to be works, they're just things that I'm doing. But it's to use it in a way that is... it becomes a catalyst to think about a situation or think about something else without kind of getting trapped in that fetishization of the archive and of historic material, of yellowing sellotape and all of those kind of things, So, yeah, it's always trying to kind of catch yourself before you do that. But I think I'm sure that you do things and definitely you do things and you look back and you think, that was wrong. I shouldn't have done it that way. It's part of doing it. But I think that's why it's really good to be doing exhibitions and you kind of stop and you look at it and you work it out. Something about the, what's the word on the mediation of those slide projectors I was using. I thought there was something that there was an evenness to the use of that material that perhaps doesn't translate when you just see the installation shots. That was an interesting strategy for me and something that I've used. And actually, I'm making. Are we done for time? I think it was like stop. That's it. Done. I am making a feature-length. You think some of this stuff was boring? I'm making a feature-length film about post-war British new towns. The first part was in Peterlee in the northeast, and in fact I'm just doing the next part with Milton Keynes, which will be finished for the 50th anniversary in 2017. And actually video, I think, is interesting as a way that I found it to be liberating, that I've been using archival information, but there's something about the levelling out of the plane, it all happens in this one space. That, I don't know, it's been liberating for me and it's been a useful way to work, and that's helped me with some of the other things that I'm doing now. But you navigate it along the way, and sometimes you put the feet in the right place and sometimes you fall through. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you.